Welcome to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic. In this video, we are going to review 10 of the most impactful new cards from the Tyranid Swarm pre-constructed commander deck from Warhammer 40K. We will also discuss some possible upgrades to the original deck list, as well as highlight the deck's most valuable reprint. Tyranid Swarm is a teamer deck featuring the Tyranid tribe and has +1/+1 counter and X-Spell themes woven into the build. The front-facing commander of this deck, the Swarm Lord, is a 5/5 Tyranid for 3 in teamer colors. The Swarm Lord enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it for each time we've cast it from the command zone this game. So after its first casting, it ETBs as a 7/7. Whenever a creature we control with a counter on it dies, we draw a card. As the Swarm Lord always enters the battlefield with +1/+1 counters on it after its initial casting, as long as we cast it from the command zone, we will draw a card whenever it dies. The secondary commander option, Magus Lucia Kane, is a 1/1 humid Tyranid wizard for 1 in teamer colors. At the beginning of combat on our turn, we put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. We can tap Magus Lucia Kane and add 2 colorless mana to our mana pool. When we next cast a spell with X in its mana cost, or activate an ability with X in its activation cost this turn, we copy this spell or ability. We may choose new targets for the copy. We have 2 very different commanders featured in the same build. The Swarm Lord puts cards in our hand, but is dependent on creatures with counters on them dying in order to do so. Even in a dedicated +1/+1 counter build, that's not always guaranteed to happen. Magus Lucia Kane can function independently from other creatures, and as long as we have X spells to cast from our hand or X abilities to activate from the battlefield, Lucia can copy one of them. Lucia seems more impactful to the game with her ability to copy X spells and effects, and I prefer her in the command zone over the Swarm Lord. The most valuable reprint in Tyranid Swarm is Herald's Horn. This is the 3rd time Herald's Horn has been reprinted since making its debut in the Commander 2017 product. It is a staple in tribal builds due to its abilities to reduce the mana cost of a tribe and to provide card advantage. The following list of cards, ranked in no particular order, jumped right off of the screen as very impactful additions to the Commander format, particularly for their versatility of being played in a variety of different decks. Ethelon Jackal is a 2/2 humid Tyranid scout with trample and haste for 1 in Gruul colors. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, we may search our library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. A very valuable creature in the early game, Ethelon Jackal has a rampant growth effect stapled to its hasty and tramply body. It's reasonable to cast this Jackal on turn 2 or 3 and immediately send it into combat while our opponents are ramping up themselves, and its effect is repeatable as long as we hit an opponent for combat damage. Any deck with red and green in their color identities, especially landfall-themed decks like Omnath Locus of Rage, will welcome this land fetcher with arms wide open. Shadow in the Warp is an enchantment for 1 in Gruul colors. The first creature spell we cast each turn costs 2 generic mana less to cast. Whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, this enchantment deals 2 damage to that player. Traditionally, Gruul decks want to cast them some biggins, turn them sideways, and watch their opponent's life totals plummet towards 0. Reducing the mana value of the first creature spell cast during our turn by 2 helps us to quicken the beatdown, while Shadow in the Warp's second ability provides additional damage to our opponents whenever they cast their first non-creature spell each turn. As a bonus, the mana reduction could help mitigate commander tax that has accrued by our general. Shadow in the Warp seems like a great fit in a Xenagos God of Revels deck, or any deck sporting Gruul colors that cares about casting themselves some biggins. Bone Sabers is an equipment for 3 and 1 green mana and has an equip cost of 3 generic mana. Whenever equipped creature attacks, we put 4 +1/+1 counters on it. By itself, this equipment beefs up the equipped creature. But in a build with a +1/+1 counter theme, when paired with cards like Doubling Season, Branching Evolution, or even Primal Vigor, then Bone Sabers becomes even more powerful, nearly to the tune of a potential win condition. Remember, the +1/+1 counters are placed on the creature, not the equipment. So if the equipment gets destroyed, the counters stay on the creature. Stompy decks with green should consider this equipment as a combat enhancer, particularly in Voltron builds. Sporosis is a Tyranid with Defender for XX green and has the new Ravenous mechanic. The double X signifies the need to pay the exact same mana value for X when casting the spell. Sporosis enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it, and if X is 5 or more, then we draw a card when it enters. That's what the Ravenous mechanic does. So we need to pay 11 total mana to produce a defender with 5 +1/+1 counters on it that draws us a card when it ETBs. This is not impactful enough to warrant conclusion into many decks. However, when Sporocyst ETBs, we search our library for up to X basic lands and put them onto the battlefield tapped. We get the same land fetching effect for the same mana value as Farhaven Elf, a creature that's in over 50,000 commander decks registered at edhrec.com. A difference between the two is that we can't attack with Sporocyst because it has Defender. We'll take that limitation because the upside is much more beneficial. Remember, this is an XX spell. If we pay a total of 5 mana, X equals 2, and we search our library for 2 basic lands instead of 1. The potential to use Sporocyst's X value incrementally provides versatility and power to any lands, matter, or landfall decks, of which the color green generally is featured. Look for Sporocyst to begin making many appearances in these aforementioned lands, matter, or landfall decks. Malanthrope is a 2/2 Tyranid with flying for 1 in Simic colors, and when it enters the battlefield, we exile target player's graveyard and put a +1/+1 counter on Malanthrope for each creature card exiled this way. In Simic colors, we have the ability to provide flash to this creature through the use of Alchemist's Refuge, Leyline of Anticipation, or the tried and true Vidalcan Orrery. Imagine flashing in Malanthrope at the end of our last opponent's turn, or in response to some kind of opponent-driven graveyard chicanery. Suddenly, we end up with a massive flying threat for the paltry investment of only 3 mana. Even without the flash, this creature is well supported in its colors and has a powerful element of interaction that could be added to any decks with green and blue in their color identities. Hierophant of Biotitan is a 12/12 Tyranid with Vigilance, Reach, and Ward 2 for 10 and 2 green mana, and it cannot be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. As an additional cost to cast the spell, we may remove any number of +1/+1 counters from among creatures we control. Hierophant Biotitan costs 2 generic mana less for each counter removed this way. Exceedingly powerful in +1/+1 counter builds, this creature easily could cost just 2 green mana for a 12/12 that can attack each combat comfortably, limits chump blocking, has some protection with its Ward 2 ability, and easily dissuades our opponents from attacking us, unless they want to attack into a 12/12 with Reach. If a deck has a +1/+1 counter theme and has green in its color identity, then it would be difficult not to include Hierophant Biotitan. Exocrine is a 2/2 Tyranid with Ravenous for X 2 and 1 red mana, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals X damage to each player and each other creature. If X is 5 or greater, then we draw a card when it ETBs. Yes, this will deal direct damage to us, but more importantly, it should rid the battlefield of all of our opponent's creatures and also send their life totals southward as a result. Creatures with this type of interaction can be very powerful, particularly because it is immune to its own direct damage ability and remains on the battlefield after the dust settles. Decks with red that are in need of mass direct damage sources could do a lot worse than Exocrine. Nexos is a 2/2 human Tyranid advisor for 1/1 green mana and gives basic lands we control tap, add 2 colorless mana that can only be spent on costs that contain X. Of course, this is a green card because, well, green. Imagine the mana that can be generated for a Chord of Calling, a Genesis Wave, tower counters for Helix Pinnacle, or a game-ending Finale of Devastation. Nexos is also a powerful addition to Hydra decks and any Sultai builds with Villainous Wealth in the 99. Its most powerful fit seems to be in a Zaxara the Exemplary build, where the deck's basic lands will produce bigger and more powerful X spells through which Zaxara synergizes so very, very well. Gerson Starn Kellermorph is a 3/2 legendary human Tyranid with Ward 2 for 1 in Izzet colors. Whenever another source we control deals exactly 1 point of damage to a permanent or player, Gerson deals 2 damage to that permanent or player, totaling 3 points of damage. In a classic Izzet spell-slinging build, we inundate the 99 with spells that deal 1 point of damage to multiple targets and pair them with a multitude of spells and effects that copy those spells. Gerson has the potential to propel himself to the top of the Izzet general food chain. He is such an intriguing option coming out of the command zone that it may force us to build an Izzet EDH deck with this legend as the general. Old One Eye is a 6/6 legendary Tyranid with Trample for 5 and 1 green mana and gives other creatures we control Trample. When Old One Eye enters the battlefield, we create a 5/5 green Tyranid creature token. At the beginning of our pre-combat main phase, we may discard 2 cards. If we do, then we return Old One Eye from our graveyard to our hand. Absolute power. Old One Eye is an absolute tower of power coming out of the 99. When it ETBs, we get 11 total power and 11 total toughness stretched across 2 trampling bodies for just 6 mana. We can recur it to our hand by discarding 2 cards, and its mana value of 5 and 1 green allows it to be included in the 99 of any deck with green, even 5-color builds. As a commander option in a mono-green build, Old One-Eye's recursive ability provides the option of exchanging cards in our hand as a way to avoid paying commander taxes whenever it dies. We let Old One-Eye go to the graveyard instead of returning it to the command zone, and even if our graveyard is exiled by an opponent, then we can elect to have Old One-Eye go to the command zone instead as it awaits its return to the battlefield. We'd be playing mono green, so mana shouldn't be a problem. All of this, and we haven't even focused on the 5/5 Tyranid creature tokens that are created each time Old One-Eye ETBs. Whether it's inside the 99 or coming out of the command zone, Old One-Eye has the potential to become one of the most impactful green cards from the Warhammer 40K commander decks. Aside from the obvious additions like Doubling Season, Branching Evolution, Primal Vigor, and Unbound Flourishing, the following cards are possible upgrades to the Tyranid Swarm original deck list. These cards are focused on enhancing and optimizing the +1/+1 counter theme of this build, with an eye on choosing Magus Lucia Kane as the general. As a +1/+1 counter magnet, Forgotten Ancient can get out of hand in a hurry. Anytime a player casts a spell, it gets a +1/+1 counter, and at the beginning of our upkeep, we can spread around any number of these +1/+1 counters to any of our other creatures. As counter synergies go, few options are more impactful than Forgotten Ancient. Another option is Mana Gorger Hydra. It gets a +1/+1 counter whenever a player casts a spell as well, but it has Trample. After a round of turns, this Hydra could easily enter into combat with 5 or 6 counters on it, providing a tremendous return on the meager investment of 3 mana. Colonian Hydra doubles the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature we control whenever it attacks, and it doubles its own counters as well. It does not need to deal combat damage to an opponent for this ability to trigger. It just has to be turned sideways and declared as an attacker. This is a game-ending ability in a deck that focuses on +1/+1 counters. Speaking of doubling +1/+1 counters, whenever Deep Glow Skein enters the battlefield, we double the number of each kind of counter on any number of target permanents. This is just another win condition that synergizes amazingly with our +1/+1 counter theme. Arguably one of the most powerful Hydras in Magic, Hydroid Krasis has flying and trample and draws us half X cards and gains us half X life, rounded down each time. Having a monstrous flying and trampling Hydra aside, tapping out to draw as many cards as possible never felt so good. Lifeblood Hydra may be a little tricky to cast in a 3-color deck because of its triple green mana cost, but its rewards outweigh the risks. It ETBs with X+1/+1 counters on it, and when it dies, we gain life and draw cards equal to its power. The life gain is nice, but the card draw is obscene and easily should refill our hand. Although it doesn't double the number of +1/+1 counters on our creatures, Vigor provides us with a much more unique benefit, one that should cause many headaches for our opponents. If damage would be dealt to another creature we control, we prevent that damage and put a +1/+1 counter on that creature for each 1 damage prevented this way, as if having a swarm of +1/+1 counter infused biggins wasn't intimidating enough. If blocked, they just get bigger and bigger and bigger. Vigor should close out games very quickly once it hits the battlefield. Invariably, our creatures will die. Let's pay it forward by placing the Departed's +1/+1 counters onto the Ozolith. With enough +1/+1 counters stored on this artifact, we have the ability to easily one-shot an opponent. With so many creatures receiving the benefit of +1/+1 counter enhancement, Herald of Secret Streams rewards them further by making them unblockable in combat. If our opponents can't get this Merfolk warrior off of the battlefield, then the game should be over in short order. We can consider Herald of Secret Streams as a win condition in a +1/+1 counter themed deck. Since we're throwing around +1/+1 counters like nobody's business, let's include another alternate win condition with Simic Ascendancy. With the prevalence of +1/+1 counter spells and effects running rampant in the 99 of this build, locking in a victory with Simic Ascendancy should be as easy as Sunday morning. And that concludes our review of the Tyranid Swarm pre-constructed commander deck from Warhammer 40K. Which cards did we leave out? Which new cards are your favorite, and which cards would you suggest for the purposes of upgrading the original deck list of this build? Let me know in the comments section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic.